The wind carried the scent of gunpowder and crushed pine needles across the Blackwater Ridge shooting complex as Maya Chen steadied her trembling hands around the grip of her rifle. 800 meters downrange, the target appeared no larger than a postage stamp through the scope, wavering like a mirage in the afternoon heat. Behind her, she could hear the snickers from the gallery, a dozen seasoned marksmen who'd watched her arrive that morning with skeptical eyes and barely concealed amusement. "Look at those hands shake," whispered Derek Martinson, a barrel-chested former Marine whose trophy case at home groaned under the weight of his competition medals. "She can barely hold the damn thing steady." His companion, a weathered hunting guide named Buck Rawlings, chuckled as he adjusted his well-worn baseball cap. "Hell, I've seen leaf blowers with less vibration. What's she doing here anyway? This is the Western States Long-Range Championship, not some weekend plinker session." Maya's hands did shake. They'd been shaking for the better part of 3 years now, ever since the accident that had stolen so much from her. The essential tremor, the doctors called it, a neurological condition that turns simple tasks into exercises in frustration. Writing her name required concentration, holding a coffee cup demanded both hands, and shooting, the one thing that had defined her for most of her 32 years, had become a source of embarrassment rather than pride. But she was here anyway, on this scorching August afternoon in the high desert of eastern Oregon, because of a promise she'd made to someone who could no longer hear her words. The rifle she cradled was a custom Remington 700, its stock worn smooth by countless hours of practice. The wood bore the faint impressions of her grandfather's hands, tiny dents and scratches that told the story of a lifetime spent in pursuit of precision. Chen Wei had been a different kind of shooter, a hunter who believed in taking only clean shots, a craftsman who hand-loaded every cartridge, a teacher who'd spent countless summer afternoons showing his granddaughter that true marksmanship wasn't about power or noise, but about patience, breath, and the space between heartbeats. "Remember, little sparrow," he'd told her when she was barely tall enough to see over the shooting bench, his voice carrying the gentle accent of his childhood in Taiwan. "The rifle doesn't know if you're scared. The bullet doesn't care if your hands shake. What matters is here." He'd tapped his temple. "And here," he'd placed his weathered hand over her small heart. "Find the stillness inside the storm." That wisdom seemed hollow now, as Maya fought to control her wayward nervous system. The tremor wasn't constant. It came in waves, triggered by stress, fatigue, or the simple weight of other people's expectations. On good days, she could almost forget about it. On bad days, like today, it felt like her body was betraying everything she'd ever worked to achieve. The range officer, a no-nonsense woman named Carol Brennan, who'd seen every type of shooter come and go over her 20 years of running competitions, called out over the loudspeaker, "Shooters, you have 2 minutes for final equipment checks. First relay will commence at 1400 hours sharp." Maya forced herself to breathe deeply, drawing in the thin mountain air and tasting the familiar cocktail of hope and fear that preceded every competition. She'd driven 8 hours from her small apartment in Bend to be here, using vacation days she couldn't afford to lose from her job at the forestry office. Her savings account, already stretched thin by medical bills and the modifications needed to make her daily life manageable, had taken another hit from the entry fees and ammunition costs. But money wasn't really why she was here. She was here because of the letter. It had arrived 3 months ago, forwarded from her grandfather's old address by the current homeowner. The envelope was yellowed with age, her name written in Chen Wei's precise handwriting, the same careful strokes he'd used to teach her Chinese characters on quiet Sunday afternoons. Inside,
She'd found a single sheet of paper and a small brass medallion that she now wore on a chain around her neck. The letter was dated 2 weeks before his death, though she'd never seen it before now. In it, her grandfather had written about his own struggles with age and illness, about the way his once steady hands had begun to fail him in his final years. But more than that, he'd written about belief, not in perfection, but in the courage to try when trying seemed impossible. "The mountains don't care if we're worthy to climb them," his letter had concluded. "They only care that we begin the journey. Your shaking hands may be a gift, little sparrow, if they teach you what I could not. That strength comes not from the absence of struggle, but from the choice to struggle beautifully." Now, as she settled into position behind the firing line, Maya could feel the weight of that medallion against her chest, a small bronze circle engraved with a sparrow in flight. It had been her grandfather's, given to him by his own father before the family's exodus from mainland China. 3 generations of marksmen, 3 stories of hands learning to find stillness in chaos. The other competitors were settling into their positions now, a mix of military veterans, law enforcement officers, and serious civilian shooters whose gear probably cost more than Maya made in 6 months. She recognized some faces from smaller competitions, men and women who'd nodded politely at her before, but had never quite taken her seriously. After all, what threat could she pose with hands that shook like autumn leaves? To her left, Derek Martinson was adjusting his high-end spotting scope with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his abilities. His rifle was a work of art, a custom build that probably cost $15,000, every component selected for maximum precision. He caught her looking and offered a patronizing smile. "First time shooting long range?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough false kindness to mask the condescension underneath. "Something like that," Maya replied quietly, not wanting to explain that she'd been shooting since she was 8 years old, that she had once held junior records at this very range, and the tremor in her hands was a relatively recent development in a lifetime dedicated to the sport. To her right, a young woman named Sarah Kim was setting up equipment that looked borrowed, mismatched components that spoke of a shooter working within tight budget constraints. Sarah couldn't have been more than 25, and she moved with the nervous energy of someone trying to prove herself in a sport dominated by older, more established competitors. She caught Maya's eye and offered a quick, genuine smile. "Nervous?" Sarah asked, and Maya was surprised by the kindness in her voice. "Always," Maya admitted, and realized that this simple honesty felt better than any pretense she might have maintained. The range stretched out before them like a vast amphitheater of possibility and judgment. 800 meters of rolling high desert punctuated by sagebrush and the occasional stunted juniper. The targets themselves were barely visible to the naked eye, small paper squares mounted on steel frames that would ring like bells when struck. Between the firing line and the targets lay a complex geography of wind currents, temperature gradients, and atmospheric pressure variations that could turn even the most perfect shot into a disappointing near miss. Maya had studied this range for years, memorizing its moods and quirks through countless visits with her grandfather. She knew that the wind typically shifted from southwest to northwest around 2 in the afternoon, influenced by the thermal patterns created by the nearby ridgeline. She understood how the thin air at 4,200 feet of elevation would affect bullet trajectory and how the bright desert sun could create mirage effects that made accurate range estimation a challenge. But all that knowledge felt fragile now, undermined by the physical reality of her condition. As if summoned by her worry, another tremor ran through her hands, causing the rifle to waver noticeably. Behind her, she heard Buck Rawlings mutter something about amateur hour. Carol Brennan's voice crackled over the public address system again. "Shooters, take your positions. Relay 1 begins in 60 seconds. You'll have 15 minutes to fire 10 shots for record. Wind flags are active. Mirage boards are in position. Good luck." Maya closed her eyes for a moment, trying to find the center of calm that her grandfather had taught her to cultivate. In her mind, she could see his weathered face, patient and encouraging even in his final years when illness had robbed him of so much. She remembered the last time they'd shot together, 6 months before his death, when his own hands had shaken with the palsy that would eventually help claim his life. "The tremor isn't your enemy," he'd told her that day, watching as she struggled with her first symptoms. "It's just another variable to account for, like wind or temperature. A good marksman adapts to conditions, doesn't fight them." Easy words to remember, harder wisdom to embody. But as Maya opened her eyes and looked downrange toward the target that would either validate or humiliate her, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not confidence exactly. That would come later, if at all, but something more fundamental. A kind of stubborn refusal to be defined by what others expected from her shaking hands. The medallion felt warm against her skin as she settled into her shooting position, and for just a moment, she could swear she felt her grandfather's presence beside her, patient and unwavering as the mountains themselves. The first shot would tell the story, but already Maya knew something that the snickering gallery behind her did not. Sometimes the steadiest aim comes not from hands that never shake, but from a heart that refuses to stop trying. Maya's mornings began at 5:30 a.m. with a ritual that had taken months to perfect. She would sit on the edge of her narrow bed in the studio apartment she rented above Chen's Asian market, a coincidence of naming that had felt like destiny when she'd first seen the "for rent" sign, and perform a series of hand exercises designed to manage her essential tremor. Squeeze a stress ball 20 times with each hand, rotate her wrists in slow, deliberate circles, flex and extend her fingers while counting backwards from 100. The exercises didn't eliminate the shaking. Nothing could do that. But they gave her a sense of agency over her condition, a feeling that she wasn't entirely at the mercy of her malfunctioning nervous system. Some days were better than others. Some days the tremor was barely noticeable, a faint flutter that she could ignore or compensate for with conscious effort. Other days, it felt like her hands belonged to someone else entirely, unreliable instruments that turned simple tasks into exercises in frustration. Today, 3 hours before the championship would begin, was somewhere in between. The tremor was present, but manageable, a background hum of neurological static that she'd learned to work around rather than against. She made coffee using a special mug with wide handles, one of many adaptive tools she had reluctantly incorporated into her daily routine. The kitchen counter bore the scars of her learning curve, small nicks and stains from dropped knives and spilled liquids, evidence of a proud woman learning to navigate a changed world. Her apartment was small but carefully organized, every item placed with the precision of someone who couldn't afford to waste energy searching for misplaced objects. The walls were covered with photographs from her shooting career, junior championships, college team photos, images of her standing beside her grandfather at various ranges across the Pacific Northwest. In one corner stood a gun safe that cost more than her first car, home to the rifles that represented both her past achievements and her uncertain future.
The Remington 700 that would accompany her to the championship had required extensive modification to accommodate her condition. The stock had been custom-fitted with a specialized grip system that helped distribute the rifle's weight more evenly across both hands. The trigger had been adjusted to a lighter pull weight, reducing the fine motor control required to fire accurately. Even the scope had been selected for its forgiving eye relief, allowing for slight variations in cheek weld that her tremor might cause. These modifications represented months of research, consultation with gunsmiths, and expenditures that had strained her budget to the breaking point. Each change had been a small surrender, an acknowledgement that the shooter she'd once been was gone forever. But there were also acts of adaptation, proof that she wasn't ready to give up entirely. Maya worked as a GIS specialist for the Oregon Department of Forestry, a job that made use of her degree in environmental science and her eye for detail. The work was largely computer-based, which suited her condition well. Typing was one activity where her tremor actually seemed to improve with practice. Her colleagues knew about her medical situation, but most had never made the connection between her desk job and her shooting background. She preferred it that way, finding that explaining her former abilities only invited pity or skepticism. Her supervisor, Janet Morrison, had been understanding when Maya needed time off for medical appointments, or the occasional bad day when the tremor made even basic tasks difficult. But Maya could sense the limits of that patience, especially as budget cuts forced the department to do more with fewer people. She'd started staying late to compensate for any productivity lost to her condition, a habit that only added to her stress and potentially worsened her symptoms. The financial pressure was constant and growing. Her health insurance covered some of her medical expenses, but not the occupational therapy, specialized equipment, or experimental treatments she'd tried in hopes of managing her condition. The modifications to her rifle had cost nearly $3,000, money she'd scraped together by selling some of her grandfather's less essential firearms, a decision that had felt like betrayal even as she'd made it. But perhaps the most difficult aspect of living with essential tremor wasn't financial or practical. It was psychological. Maya had defined herself as a shooter for most of her life. The sport had given her confidence, community, and a sense of mastery that few other activities could match. When her hands began to shake, she didn't just lose a hobby, she lost a fundamental piece of her identity. The first symptoms had appeared almost 3 years ago, initially so subtle that she'd attributed them to caffeine or stress. A slight tremor in her dominant hand while writing, barely noticeable except for someone who'd spent decades training for activities requiring absolute steadiness. She'd tried switching coffee brands, getting more sleep, reducing stress through yoga and meditation. Nothing had helped. The diagnosis had come after months of testing, a process that had felt like watching herself fail in slow motion. Neurologists, specialists, blood tests, MRI scans, all building toward the conclusion that her nervous system was betraying her for reasons no one could fully explain. Essential tremor wasn't life-threatening, the doctors had assured her. Many people lived full, productive lives while managing the condition. But for someone whose identity was built around precision and control, the diagnosis had felt like a death sentence. Her first shooting session after the diagnosis had been a disaster. At her home range, a small club where she'd been a member for over a decade, she'd struggled to hit targets that had once seemed impossibly large. Other shooters had noticed, offering well-meaning advice about stance and breathing that completely missed the point. She'd left early, embarrassed and furious, and hadn't returned for 3 months. The isolation had been almost worse than the physical symptoms. Shooting had been her social world as much as her passion. Weekend competitions, range sessions with friends, evenings spent reloading ammunition and discussing equipment, all of it became uncomfortable reminders of what she'd lost. Some friends had tried to stay connected, but relationships built around a shared activity tend to fade when that activity becomes impossible. Her grandfather had been her only real confidant during those dark months. Chen had understood loss in ways that few people could, having fled his homeland as a young man and rebuilt his life from nothing in a foreign country. When Maya had finally confessed her diagnosis to him, he'd listened without judgment or false optimism. "I've been watching you," he'd said during one of their last conversations, his own hands shaking with the palsy that accompanies advanced age. "You think this tremor has made you a different person. But you're wrong. You're the same little sparrow who used to outshoot boys twice her size.
The same granddaughter who learned to hand-load ammunition because she wanted to understand every part of the process. Your hands are different now, but your heart is the same. He died before she could find the courage to pick up a rifle again, before she could test his faith in her unchanged heart. The funeral had been small. Chen had outlived most of his contemporaries, and Maya had delivered a eulogy that focused on his wisdom, his patience, and his unwavering belief that every challenge contained the seeds of its own solution. It was only months later, when the letter arrived, that she'd understood what he meant. The championship entry form had arrived in her mailbox on the same day as her grandfather's posthumous message, a coincidence that had felt too significant to ignore. The Western States Long-Range Championship was one of the most prestigious civilian shooting competitions in the country, drawing participants from across the region and beyond. Entry fees were substantial, equipment requirements were strict, and the level of competition was intimidating even for experienced marksmen. Maya had stared at the form for weeks, torn between the desire to honor her grandfather's memory and the fear of public humiliation. Her practice sessions had been inconsistent. Some days she could achieve respectable groups at shorter ranges, other days she couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. The 800-meter distance of the championship was far beyond anything she'd attempted since her diagnosis. But the letter had contained more than just encouragement. Hidden in her grandfather's careful words was a story she'd never heard before, about his own struggles with self-doubt and physical limitations. Chen had apparently suffered from severe asthma as a young man, a condition that had made him weak and often short of breath. His father had encouraged him to take up shooting as a way to build confidence and lung control, never expecting his sickly son to develop into a true marksman. "I learned to shoot between breaths, to find the moment of stillness between the struggle for air. Your tremor may teach you the same lesson, to find steadiness not in the absence of movement, but in the spaces between movements." The concept had haunted Maya for weeks. She'd returned to the range tentatively, approaching her practice sessions more like meditation than training. Instead of fighting her tremor, she began to study it, learning its rhythms and patterns. She discovered that the shaking followed predictable cycles, moments of intensity followed by brief periods of relative calm. If she could time her shots to coincide with those calm moments, the breakthrough that come during a humid Thursday afternoon at her local range. She'd been struggling with a particularly difficult group, her hands shaking badly due to a combination of frustration and the caffeine from too much morning coffee. In desperation, she'd tried something different. Instead of fighting for control, she'd simply waited, breathed deeply, watched the tremor cycle through her hands like waves on a shore, and then, in the brief stillness between waves, she'd taken the shot. Bullseye. The success had felt almost accidental at first, a lucky coincidence rather than a technique she could replicate. But over the following weeks, she'd refined the approach, learning to read her body's signals with the same precision she'd once applied to wind flags and mirage indicators. The tremor became just another environmental factor to account for, no different from temperature or atmospheric pressure. Her groups began to tighten. Her confidence slowly returned. And eventually, Maya had filled out the championship entry form and mailed it with a check she couldn't really afford, making a promise to her grandfather's memory and to the part of herself that refused to be defined by what her hands could no longer do. Now, as she finished her morning coffee and prepared to leave for the range, Maya felt the familiar mixture of excitement and terror that preceded every significant shooting competition. Her hands were shaking. They would probably shake all day, But for the first time in years, that fact didn't feel like an insurmountable obstacle. It was simply another condition to work with, another variable in the complex equation of long-range precision shooting.
She packed her gear with the methodical care of someone who couldn't afford to forget anything important. Ammunition, tools, spotting scope, shooting mat, logbook, every item checked against a mental list she'd refined over years of competition. The rifle went into its padded case with the reverence reserved for valuable instruments, and the brass medallion went around her neck where it belonged. As she locked her apartment and headed down to her car, Maya caught sight of her reflection in the storefront window of Chen's Asian market. She looked the same as always. Average height, practical clothes, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that wouldn't interfere with her shooting position. But there was something different in her posture, a quality of determination that hadn't been there in years. Today, she would find out whether her grandfather's faith in her unchanged heart had been justified, whether the tremor in her hands was truly just another variable to master, or whether some limitations couldn't be overcome through will and adaptation alone. The drive to Blackwater Ridge would take 4 hours, plenty of time to think and worry and second-guess her decision to compete. But as Maya started her car and pulled out into the morning traffic, she found herself humming an old Chinese lullaby her grandfather used to sing, a song about sparrows learning to fly despite the wind. The Blackwater Ridge shooting complex sprawled across 500 acres of high desert, its various ranges and facilities connected by gravel roads that kicked up dust clouds in the dry August heat. Maya arrived 3 hours before the championship would begin, wanting time to familiarize herself with the range conditions and settle for nerves before the serious competitors showed up. The parking lot was already half full with trucks and SUVs bearing license plates from across the western states, their beds loaded with gun cases and equipment boxes. She chose a parking spot away from the main cluster of vehicles, hoping to avoid the inevitable pre-competition socializing that she'd never been particularly good at even in her prime. The tremor seemed worse when she was nervous, and the prospect of making awkward small talk while her hands visibly shook felt like an unnecessary additional challenge. The registration table was set up under a large canopy near the main clubhouse, presided over by Carol Brennan and 2 assistants who were checking identification and processing entry fees with the efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. Maya waited in line behind a group of shooters who were discussing barrel harmonics and hand-loading techniques with the casual expertise of true enthusiasts. She recognized some names from online forums in shooting magazines, serious competitors who traveled the national circuit and whose equipment represented investments that rivaled small cars. "First time at Blackwater?" asked the shooter in front of her, a weathered man in his 60s whose polo shirt bore the logo of a major ammunition manufacturer. "First time at this competition," Maya replied carefully, not wanting to reveal too much about her background. "It's a challenging range," the man continued, seemingly oblivious to her reticence. "That 800-meter distance can be humbling even for experienced shooters. Wind conditions change constantly due to the ridgeline, and the mirage can play tricks on your eyes. You shooting production class or open?" "Production," Maya said, grateful for a question she could answer without revealing her condition. The production class limited competitors to more basic equipment, while open class allowed for expensive accessories that could provide significant advantages. "Smart choice for a first-timer," the man nodded approvingly. "Less gear to worry about, more focus on fundamentals. Though I have to say, some of the open-class shooters today..." She packed her gear with the methodical care of someone who couldn't afford to forget anything important. Ammunition, tools, spotting scope, shooting mat, logbook, every item checked against a mental list she'd refined over years of competition. The rifle went into its padded case with the reverence reserved for valuable instruments, and the brass medallion went around her neck where it belonged. As she locked her apartment and headed down to her car, Maya caught sight of her reflection in the storefront window of Chen's Asian market. She looked the same as always. Average height, practical clothes, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that wouldn't interfere with her shooting position. But there was something different in her posture, a quality of determination that hadn't been there in years. Today, she would find out whether her grandfather's faith in her unchanged heart had been justified, whether the tremor in her hands was truly just another variable to master, or whether some limitations couldn't be overcome through will and adaptation alone. The drive to Blackwater Ridge would take 4 hours, plenty of time to think and worry and second-guess her decision to compete. But as Maya started her car and pulled out into the morning traffic, she found herself humming an old Chinese lullaby her grandfather used to sing, a song about sparrows learning to fly despite the wind. The Blackwater Ridge shooting complex sprawled across 500 acres of high desert, its various ranges and facilities connected by gravel roads that kicked up dust clouds in the dry August heat. Maya arrived 3 hours before the championship would begin, wanting time to familiarize herself with the range conditions and settle for nerves before the serious competitors showed up. The parking lot was already half full with trucks and SUVs bearing license plates from across the western states, their beds loaded with gun cases and equipment boxes. She chose a parking spot away from the main cluster of vehicles, hoping to avoid the inevitable pre-competition socializing that she'd never been particularly good at even in her prime. The tremor seemed worse when she was nervous, and the prospect of making awkward small talk while her hands visibly shook felt like an unnecessary additional challenge. The registration table was set up under a large canopy near the main clubhouse, presided over by Carol Brennan and 2 assistants who were checking identification and processing entry fees with the efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. Maya waited in line behind a group of shooters who were discussing barrel harmonics and hand-loading techniques with the casual expertise of true enthusiasts. She recognized some names from online forums in shooting magazines, serious competitors who traveled the national circuit and whose equipment represented investments that rivaled small cars. "First time at Blackwater?" asked the shooter in front of her, a weathered man in his 60s whose polo shirt bore the logo of a major ammunition manufacturer. "First time at this competition," Maya replied carefully, not wanting to reveal too much about her background. "It's a challenging range," the man continued, seemingly oblivious to her reticence. "That 800-meter distance can be humbling even for experienced shooters. Wind conditions change constantly due to the ridgeline, and the mirage can play tricks on your eyes. You shooting production class or open?" "Production," Maya said, grateful for a question she could answer without revealing her condition. The production class limited competitors to more basic equipment, while open class allowed for expensive accessories that could provide significant advantages. "Smart choice for a first-timer," the man nodded approvingly. "Less gear to worry about, more focus on fundamentals. Though I have to say, some of the open-class shooters today bringing serious hardware. That military team from Colorado has equipment that probably costs more than my truck." When Maya reached the registration table, Carol Brennan looked up from her clipboard with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to managing nervous competitors. "Name?" "Maya Chen." Carol's fingers moved down the list, then stopped. She looked up with slightly more interest. "Chen. Any relation to Chen Wei? He used to shoot here regularly. Wonderful marksman." "My grandfather," Maya said, feeling a familiar tightness in her chest at the mention of his name. "I'm sorry for your loss," Carol said, her official demeanor softening slightly. "We was one of our most respected competitors, always had time to help new shooters, never made anyone feel unwelcome. He talked about you often, said you had real talent." Maya nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She completed her registration and received her competitor packet, including a range map, safety briefings, and a schedule of events. The 800-meter rifle competition was scheduled for 2 p.m., giving her several hours to prepare and observe. She made her way to the firing line to examine the conditions firsthand. The range stretched out before her like a long corridor cut through the sagebrush, marked at regular intervals by numbered posts and distance markers. 800 meters seemed impossibly far, especially when she considered that the targets would appear as tiny dots through even the most powerful scopes. Wind flags fluttered at various points along the range, their colorful fabric providing visual cues about air movement that could deflect bullets several inches or more. Other competitors were already setting up spotting scopes and conducting equipment checks. Maya found an empty bench and began unpacking her gear, trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. Her hands were shaking more noticeably now, whether from nerves or the caffeine or simply the stress of being in an unfamiliar environment surrounded by serious competitors. "Excuse me, are you Maya Chen?" She turned to find a young woman approaching, the same shooter she'd noticed earlier setting up budget equipment. Sarah Kim looked even younger up close, probably not much older than Maya had been when she'd first started competing seriously. "I am," Maya replied cautiously. "I'm Sarah Kim. I've been following your grandfather's shooting articles online. He had some amazing insights about reading wind conditions. I was wondering if you might have any advice about this range. I've never shot at 800 meters before, and I'm honestly kind of terrified." Maya felt a moment of panic. Sarah clearly expected her to have inherited her grandfather's expertise, but Maya hadn't shot competitively in years and had never tackled this particular distance. Her recent practice had been limited to much shorter ranges, and she was far from confident about her own chances, let alone qualified to mentor someone else. "I'm not really the right person to ask," Maya began, but Sarah's face fell so visibly that she felt compelled to continue. "But my grandfather always said the most important thing at long range was patience. Don't rush the shot, wait for the right conditions." "That makes sense," Sarah nodded eagerly. "I've been reading everything I can find about long-range shooting, but it's hard to know what actually matters and what's just theory." Before Maya could respond, a new voice cut through their conversation. "Well, well, look what we have here." They turned to see Derek Martinson approaching, his expensive rifle case slung over one shoulder and a condescending smile playing across his weathered features. Behind him walked Buck Rawlings, who was examining Maya's setup with undisguised amusement. "Isn't that sweet?" Derek continued, his voice carrying just loud enough for other nearby competitors to hear. "The granddaughter of Chen Wei, here to carry on the family tradition. Though I have to say, that equipment looks a little modest for a championship-level competition." Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, Sarah stepped forward with surprising confidence. "There's nothing wrong with her equipment. Some of the best shooters I know use basic gear." Derek chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "Oh, honey, you're both in for a rude awakening. This isn't some local club match where everyone gets a participation trophy. This is serious competition against serious shooters with serious equipment." He gestured toward his own setup, which had obviously cost more than Maya's annual salary. The rifle alone was a work of art, a custom build with a carbon fiber stock, match-grade barrel, and scope that probably cost more than her car. Everything about his equipment screamed expense and sophistication. "I've been shooting competitively for 15 years. Military background, multiple national championships, sponsorship deals with major manufacturers. And even I respect this range enough to bring my best gear. What exactly makes you think you can compete here with a basic hunting rifle and shaking hands?" The last comment hit Maya like a physical blow. She hadn't realized her tremor was so obvious to casual observers, and the public acknowledgement felt like a spotlight shining on her greatest weakness. Around them, other competitors had stopped their preparations to listen, some looking uncomfortable with Derek's aggressive behavior, others nodding in agreement with his assessment. "At least my hands shake from a medical condition. What's your excuse for being an ass?" The comment drew a few chuckles from nearby competitors, and Derek's face flushed with anger. "You think this is a joke? Lady, I've seen combat veterans with PTSD try and compete with trimmers, and it never ends well. You're going to embarrass yourself and waste everyone's time." "That's enough." Carol Brennan's voice cut through the tension like a knife. The range officer had approached without anyone noticing, and her expression made it clear that she'd heard enough of the conversation to form an opinion about Derek's behavior. "Mr. Martinson, you know the rules about unsportsmanlike conduct. I suggest you focus on your own preparation." Derek held up his hands in mock surrender. "Just trying to save everyone some time and embarrassment. But you're right, of course.
We'll see what happens when the shooting starts." He and Buck wandered off to their assigned positions, leaving Maya feeling exposed and angry. The encounter had drawn attention she hadn't wanted, and she could feel other competitors eyeing her with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Some probably agreed with Derek's assessment. She was clearly outclassed in terms of equipment and probably experience as well. Sarah moved closer, her young face flushed with indignation. What a complete jerk! Don't listen to him. He's probably just threatened by women shooters. "Maybe he's right, though," Maya said quietly, examining her trembling hands. "Maybe I am out of my league here." "Are you kidding me?" Sarah's voice rose with passion. "Your grandfather was legendary at this range. I've read stories about some of his shots that sound almost impossible. You've got his genes, his training, and from what I can see, a lot more class than some of these other shooters." Maya wanted to explain that genetics and training might not be enough to overcome a neurological condition, but she was touched by Sarah's faith in her. It had been a long time since anyone had defended her abilities rather than making excuses for her limitations.
"Besides," Sarah continued, "that guy's equipment might be expensive, but I've been watching him set up. His shooting position is all wrong. Too much tension in his shoulders. Inconsistent cheek weld. Money can't buy good fundamentals." Despite her nervousness, Maya found herself smiling at Sarah's analysis. The young woman had clearly done her homework, and her observations about Derek's technique were surprisingly sophisticated. The morning progressed with equipment inspections, safety briefings, and practice sessions on shorter-range targets. Maya used the time to familiarize herself with the range conditions, taking careful notes about wind patterns and mirage effects. Her tremors seemed to be settling into a more manageable rhythm, though she could feel it intensifying whenever she thought about the approaching competition. Other competitors gradually filled the firing line, a diverse mix of military veterans, law enforcement officers, and serious civilian shooters. Some were clearly professionals or semi-professionals, their equipment and demeanor speaking to years of serious competition. Others, like Sarah, seemed to be talented amateurs trying to prove themselves at a higher level. Maya noticed that not everyone shared Derek's hostility toward her presence. An older woman named Helen Torres, herself a multiple champion, stopped by to introduce herself and offer some friendly advice about reading the specific wind conditions at Blackwater. A retired Marine named James Peterson complimented her rifle setup and shared some tips about managing stress during long-range shooting. But there were others who seemed to share Derek's skepticism about her qualifications. She caught whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, sideways glances that lingered on her shaking hands, the kind of subtle exclusion that didn't require overt rudeness to make its point clear. By noon, the temperature had climbed into the 90s, and heat waves were beginning to dance across the range. Maya retreated to her car for lunch and a few minutes of air conditioning, using the time to review her shooting notes and try to calm her increasingly frayed nerves. The tremor was worse when she was hot and stressed, and both conditions seemed to be intensifying as the afternoon approached. She ate a light sandwich and drank plenty of water, following the hydration routine her grandfather had taught her years ago. "The body is the platform for precision," he'd always said. "Take care of the platform, and accuracy will follow." At 1:30, competitors began gathering for the final equipment check and range assignment. Maya drew position number 15 out of 20, putting her toward the middle of the firing line, where her performance would be clearly visible to spectators and other shooters. Sarah had drawn position number 18, while Derek had somehow managed to secure position number 1, either through luck or influence.
Carol Brennan's voice crackled over the public address system. "Shooters, take your positions. You'll have 15 minutes to fire 10 shots for record. Scoring will be based on total points, with tiebreakers determined by the number of X-ring hits. The current range record is held by Chen, who shot a perfect score with 7 X-ring hits in 2018. Maya felt a chill run down her spine despite the desert heat. Her grandfather's record still stood after all these years, a testament to his skill and the difficulty of the challenge she was about to attempt. She wondered what he would think of her presence here, whether he would be proud of her courage or concerned about her chances of success. As she settled into her shooting position behind the massive rifle, Maya could feel every eye on the range focused on her trembling hands. The brass medallion felt warm against her chest, and she could almost hear her grandfather's voice in the wind that rustled through the sagebrush. "Find the stillness inside the storm, little sparrow. The mountain doesn't care if you're worthy. It only cares that you begin the journey." The first shot would either validate her presence here or confirm every skeptic's worst assumptions. Maya closed her eyes, feeling the desert wind on her face and the weight of 3 generations of marksmanship legacy pressing down on her shoulders. When she opened them again, the tremor in her hands seemed to quiet slightly, as if her grandfather's spirit had steadied them from wherever he now watched. The competition was about to begin, and Maya Chen was about to discover whether a shaking sparrow could still find the courage to fly. The brass case of Maya's first cartridge gleamed in the afternoon sunlight as she chambered it with practiced precision. Around her, 19 other competitors were going through their own pre-shot rituals, adjusting scopes, checking wind flags, settling into positions they'd refined through thousands of hours of practice. The silence on the range was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the sagebrush and the distant click of rifle bolts being cycled. Maya's hands were shaking more noticeably now, the tremor amplified by stress and the weight of every skeptical gaze focused on her position. Through her scope, the target 800 meters downrange appeared as a barely visible speck, wavering in the heat mirage like a mirage itself. She forced herself to breathe deeply, remembering her grandfather's lessons about patience and timing. Relay 1. You may commence firing when ready. 15 minutes on the clock, starting now. The first shots rang out almost immediately from either end of the firing line, the confident reports of experienced competitors who'd already read the conditions and settled on their approach. Derek Martinson's expensive rifle spoke first from position 1, followed quickly by several others. Maya waited, watching the wind flags and studying the rhythm of her own tremor. The shaking in her hands followed a predictable pattern she'd learned to read over months of careful observation. Intense tremor for 15 to 20 seconds, followed by a brief period of relative calm lasting perhaps 5 seconds. During that calm window, she had to be ready to take her shot with no hesitation or second-guessing. She watched, waited, breathed. The first period of calm arrived, and Maya's crosshairs settled naturally onto the target. Without conscious thought, her finger found the trigger and applied the precise pressure her muscle memory demanded. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and 800 meters downrange, the target frame rang with the distinctive sound of a hit. "Target 15, 9 ring," called the spotter through his binoculars. A solid hit, though not spectacular. Maya felt a wave of relief wash over her. At least she wouldn't embarrass herself with a complete miss on her opening shot. She could hear murmurs from the gallery behind her, probably surprised that her shaking hands had managed to hit the target at 800 meters at all. She chambered her second round and resumed her study of wind and tremor. The breeze had shifted slightly, coming more from the southwest now, and she adjusted her point of aim accordingly. The second period of calm came, and she fired again. "Target 15, X ring." This time, the murmurs behind her were louder, tinged with genuine surprise. An X-ring hit at 800 meters was a mark of serious precision, the kind of shot that separated recreational shooters from true marksmen. Maya allowed herself a small smile as she prepared her third round. The pattern continued. Maya would wait for her hands to settle, study the conditions, and fire during the brief windows when her tremor subsided. Her third shot scored another 9, Her fourth shot found the X-ring again. By her fifth shot, another X-ring hit. The atmosphere on the range had begun to change. "Jesus Christ," she heard someone whisper behind her. "Chen's granddaughter is putting on a clinic." Derek Martinson, meanwhile, was struggling. His expensive equipment and years of experience had produced a respectable but unspectacular string of shots, mostly 8s and 9s, with one disappointing 7 when he'd misjudged a wind shift. Maya could see him growing increasingly frustrated as he glanced down the firing line toward her position. Sarah Kim was shooting steadily, if unremarkably, her budget equipment limiting her precision, but her fundamentals keeping her in contention. Several of the more experienced competitors were having excellent days, their shots clustering in the high-scoring rings with the consistency that comes from years of practice. But Maya was doing something different, something that made the experienced shooters and range officers pause in their activities to watch. Her sixth shot, X-ring. Her seventh shot, X-ring. Her eighth shot, 9-ring, but close enough to the center that the spotter had to look twice to make the call. "Target 15 has fired 8 shots," announced Carol Brennan, her voice carrying a note of excitement that she was struggling to suppress. "Current score, 6 X-rings and 2 9s. That's 78 points out of a possible 80. A hush fell over the spectator area. Maya was shooting at a level that few competitors achieved even on their best days, and she was doing it with hands that visibly shook between shots. The impossibility of what they were witnessing was beginning to dawn on even the most experienced observers. Maya herself was entering a state of focused calm she hadn't experienced in years. The tremor was still there, but it had become just another variable to account for, no different from wind speed or temperature. She'd found the rhythm her grandfather had spoken of, the stillness inside the storm that made precision possible despite apparent chaos. Her ninth shot required a longer wait. The tremor seemed stronger now, perhaps triggered by the growing attention and the pressure of maintaining her performance. Maya closed her eyes and visualized her grandfather standing beside her, his weathered hands steady on an imaginary rifle. "Patience, little sparrow. The target will wait. The mountain will wait. Only fear rushes." When the tremor subsided, Maya opened her eyes and found her sight picture perfect. The crosshairs were centered exactly where she wanted them. The wind flag showed stable conditions, and her breathing was controlled and steady. She pressed the trigger with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where the bullet would go. "Target 15, X-ring!"
The crowd behind her erupted in whispers and gasps. 7 X-rings out of 9 shots was championship-level shooting under any circumstances. But for someone with a visible medical condition to achieve such precision seemed almost supernatural. Maya had 1 shot remaining, 1 opportunity to complete what was shaping up to be a legendary performance. The pressure was enormous. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on the range, the mixture of excitement and disbelief that surrounded her position. Her hands began to shake more violently, triggered by the stress of the moment. She closed her eyes and reached for the medallion around her neck, feeling the warm bronze against her palm. In her mind, she could see her grandfather during their last shooting session together, his own hands trembling with age and illness, but his spirit undiminished. "The tremor isn't your enemy," he'd told her that day. "It's just another part of who you are now. A good marksman adapts to conditions, doesn't fight them." Maya opened her eyes and settled behind her rifle for the final time. The tremor was still there, perhaps worse than before, but she no longer saw it as an obstacle. It was simply another aspect of the shot to manage, like reading the wind or accounting for bullet drop. She watched the pattern, waited for the calm, and when it came, she was ready. The shot felt perfect the moment it left the barrel. Maya knew with absolute certainty that the bullet would find its mark, guided by months of practice and a lifetime of preparation for this single moment. 800 meters downrange, the target frame rang one final time. For a long moment, the spotter said nothing,
adjusting his binoculars and looking again to confirm what he was seeing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across the silent range with crystal clarity. Target 15, X-ring. Perfect score, 80 points with 8 X-rings. The explosion of sound from the spectator area was immediate and sustained. People were standing, applauding, some shouting in amazement at what they'd just witnessed. Maya sat behind her rifle in a daze, hardly able to process what had just happened. She had not only hit every shot, she had achieved the highest possible score with a performance that would have been impressive for any shooter, let alone someone dealing with a neurological condition. Carol Brennan was making her way down the firing line, her usual professional composure replaced by genuine excitement. "Maya," she called out, "that was absolutely extraordinary. In 20 years of running competitions, I've never seen anything quite like that." Other competitors had stopped their own shooting to watch the final few shots, and now they were approaching to offer congratulations. Even some of the most grizzled veterans seemed genuinely impressed by what they'd witnessed. "That was some seriously impressive shooting," said Helen Torres, the veteran champion Maya had met earlier. "Your grandfather would be incredibly proud." Sarah Kim was practically bouncing with excitement as she abandoned her own position to rush over. "That was amazing! I can't believe what I just watched. How did you do that with—" She stopped herself before mentioning the tremor, but her meaning was clear. Not everyone was celebrating, however. Derek Martinson had finished his own string with a respectable but unremarkable score, and his expression was dark with frustration and wounded pride. He approached Maya's position with Buck Rawlings beside him, both men wearing expressions that suggested they weren't entirely convinced by what they'd witnessed. "Well, that was certainly unexpected. Mind if I take a look at your rifle? Just curious about your setup." The request was unusual. Competitors often examined each other's equipment to learn about different approaches and modifications, but something in Derek's tone suggested more than casual interest. Maya hesitated, but decided that transparency was better than suspicion. "Of course," she said, stepping back from her rifle. Derek examined the weapon with the practiced eye of someone who understood firearms intimately. He checked the scope, tested the trigger pull, examined the stock modifications that accommodated Maya's condition. His inspection was thorough and professional, but Maya could sense that he was looking for something specific. "Interesting modifications," he finally said. "Custom trigger work, specialized grip system. Must have cost a fortune to get all of this done properly." "It was expensive," Maya admitted, not wanting to reveal exactly how much financial sacrifice the modifications had required. "I'm sure it was," Derek replied, his voice carrying an undertone that made Maya uncomfortable. "Question is, are these modifications legal under the production class rules?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Maya felt her heart rate spike as she realized what Derek was implying. Competition shooting had strict rules about equipment modifications, and violations could result in disqualification regardless of performance. Carol Brennan, who had been listening to the conversation, stepped forward with a frown. "Are you filing a formal protest, Mr. Martinson?" "I'm just asking questions," Derek replied smoothly. "It seems unusual for someone to show up out of nowhere and suddenly outshoot competitors who've been at this for decades, especially with hands that shake like that. Makes you wonder if there might be some technological assistance involved." Maya felt the blood drain from her face. The implication was clear. Derek was suggesting that her equipment modifications might constitute illegal assistance, that her performance was somehow artificial rather than the result of skill and adaptation. "That's a serious accusation," Carol said sharply. "Are you formally protesting the competitor's equipment?" Derek looked around at the gathered crowd, clearly enjoying the drama he'd created. "I think it would be appropriate to have a technical inspection of that rifle, just to make sure everything is above board." Maya's initial shock was rapidly being replaced by anger. After everything she'd overcome, after the perfect performance she'd just delivered, Derek was trying to take it away from her with bureaucratic technicalities and baseless suspicions. "Fine," she said, her voice steady despite the rage building inside her. "Inspect away. Every modification on that rifle is documented and legal. I have the paperwork in my truck if you need to see it." What followed was one of the most humiliating experiences of Maya's life. While she stood watching, a panel of range officers and technical experts dismantled her rifle piece by piece, examining every component under the scrutiny of competitors and spectators who whispered among themselves about the developing controversy. The inspection took nearly an hour. Every modification was measured, tested, and compared to the detailed rule book that governed production class competition. The custom grip system, the lighter trigger, the modified stock, all of it was scrutinized with the thoroughness of a criminal investigation. Maya watched it all with growing despair, knowing that even if she was vindicated, the shadow of suspicion would follow her performance forever. In the shooting community, whispers of cheating or equipment violations could destroy a reputation, regardless of the facts. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Carol Brennan approached with the inspection report. Her expression was unreadable as she addressed the gathered crowd.
"The equipment inspection is complete," she announced, her voice carrying across the range. "Every modification on Maya Chen's rifle has been examined and compared to production class regulations. All modifications are fully legal and properly documented. Furthermore, none of the modifications provide any artificial assistance with aiming or firing. They are purely ergonomic adaptations to accommodate the competitor's medical condition." The relief Maya felt was overwhelming, but it was quickly replaced by a different kind of anger. Derek's protest had been nothing more than poor sportsmanship disguised as concern for fair play. He tried to steal her moment of triumph with accusations he knew were baseless. "In addition," Carol continued, "I want to note for the record that Maya Chen's performance today represents some of the finest shooting I've witnessed in 2 decades of competition management. Perfect score with 8 X-rings is an achievement that speaks to exceptional skill, preparation, and mental discipline. Any suggestion that this performance was achieved through illegal means is not only wrong, but deeply insulting to a competitor who has overcome significant challenges to be here today." The crowd erupted in applause again, but Maya barely heard it. She was looking directly at Derek Martinson, who had the grace to look uncomfortable with the public rebuke he'd just received. "I was just making sure the competition was fair," he muttered, but his protest lacked conviction. "No," Maya said, stepping closer to him. "You were trying to diminish something you couldn't understand. You saw someone different, someone who didn't fit your expectations, and instead of accepting that maybe your assumptions were wrong, you decided to tear them down." She could feel her hands beginning to shake again, but this time it wasn't from her medical condition, it was from pure rage at the injustice of what had just happened. "You want to know the truth about my equipment?" Maya continued, her voice rising. "Those modifications cost me $3,000 I couldn't afford. I sold some of my grandfather's guns to pay for them, guns that meant more to me than anything I owned. I did it because I refused to let this condition define what I could or couldn't do." The range had fallen completely silent now. Even Derek seemed to realize that he'd made a serious error in judgment. "Every shot I fired today was earned through months of practice, learning to work with my condition instead of against it. Learning to find steadiness not in spite of my tremor, but because of what it taught me about patience and timing. You can inspect my equipment all you want, but you can't inspect the hours I spent figuring out how to be a marksman again when everyone told me it was impossible." Maya paused, looking around at the faces watching her, some sympathetic, some embarrassed, some simply amazed by what they'd witnessed. "My grandfather held the range record here for 7 years. Today, I broke it. Not with illegal equipment or artificial assistance, but with everything he taught me about finding strength in struggle. If you can't accept that, Mr. Martinson, then that says more about you than it does about me." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Derek looked like he wanted to disappear, and several other competitors were shaking their heads in obvious disgust at his behavior. Carol Brennan was checking the official record book, her eyes widening as she confirmed Maya's claim. "Ladies and gentlemen, I can confirm that Maya Chen's performance today of 80 points with 8 X-rings does indeed exceed the previous range record of 79 points with 7 X-rings set by Chen in 2018. We have a new champion and a new range record."
The celebration that followed was spontaneous and heartfelt. Competitors who had been strangers that morning were shaking Maya's hand and congratulating her on both her shooting and her grace under pressure. Sarah Kim was beaming as if she had won the competition herself, and even some of the veterans who had initially seemed skeptical were offering genuine praise. But for Maya, the sweetest moment came when she noticed something glinting in the afternoon sun near her shooting position. There, partially buried in the sandy soil, was a brass cartridge
Case from one of her shots. She picked it up and examined it closely. It was still warm from firing, marked with the distinctive ejector marks from her grandfather's rifle. As she held the small piece of brass, Maya felt a profound sense of completion. She had honored her grandfather's memory, proven her own worth, and perhaps most importantly, learned that some limitations exist only in the minds of those who accept them too easily. The controversy would be remembered, but not in the way Derek Martinson had intended. Instead of casting doubt on her achievement, it had only served to highlight the extraordinary nature of what she'd accomplished. Maya Chen had not only won a championship, she'd redefined what was possible when determination met preparation and refused to accept defeat. The drive home from Blackwater Ridge took place in a surreal haze of disbelief and exhaustion. Maya's trophy sat securely buckled into the passenger seat, a substantial piece of engraved crystal that reflected the late afternoon sunlight streaming through her windshield. The metal hung from her rearview mirror, its gold surface catching the light as it swayed with the motion of the car. But more precious than either official recognition was the small brass cartridge case she'd found after the competition, now resting in the cup holder beside her grandfather's medallion. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you were enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The first phone call came 20 minutes into her drive, her cell phone buzzing with an unknown number that she almost ignored. But something made her pull over at a rest stop to answer. "Maya Chen, this is Jennifer Walsh from Precision Shooting Magazine. I was at Blackwater Ridge today, and I'd love to talk to you about your incredible performance. Would you be available for an interview?" It was the first of many calls that would come over the following days. Word of her perfect score and the circumstances surrounding it had spread through the shooting community with remarkable speed. Social media posts from spectators had gone viral, shared thousands of times by people who found inspiration in the story of someone overcoming physical limitations to achieve excellence. The interview, published 3 weeks later, would be accompanied by a cover photo of Maya in her shooting position, her hands visibly trembling as she aimed downrange. The headline read, "Finding Stillness in the Storm: How Maya Chen Redefined Precision Shooting." The article focused not just on her technical achievement, but on the broader implications of her approach to working with rather than against her medical condition. Dr. Patricia Novak, a neurologist at Oregon Health and Science University who specialized in movement disorders, read the article and reached out to Maya directly. Their conversation led to an invitation to speak at a medical conference about adaptive techniques for people with essential tremor. Maya had never thought of herself as a medical case study, but she began to understand that her achievement had implications far beyond the shooting sports. "What you've accomplished challenges some fundamental assumptions about how we treat patients with movement disorders," Dr. Novak explained during their first meeting. "Too often, we focus on trying to eliminate symptoms rather than teaching people to work with their conditions. Your approach could help countless people who have given up activities they love because they think their tremor makes success impossible." The speaking engagement led to others. Maya found herself invited to share her story at shooting clubs, medical conferences, and adaptive sports organizations across the Pacific Northwest. Each appearance required her to step further outside her comfort zone, but she discovered that telling her story helped others in ways she'd never anticipated. At a Portland area shooting club, she met Robert Chen, no relation, a retired machinist whose Parkinson's disease had ended his competitive shooting career 5 years earlier. After hearing Maya's presentation, he approached her with tears in his eyes. "I threw away all my shooting equipment when the tremors got bad," he confessed. "Figured I was done with the sport forever. But listening to you, maybe I gave up too soon."
Maya spent 2 hours with Robert that evening, sharing the specific techniques she'd developed for timing shots around her tremor cycles. Within 6 months, he was competing again at local matches, his scores steadily improving as he applied her methods to his own condition. Similar stories began to accumulate. A young woman with cerebral palsy who had always believed she could never learn to shoot. A veteran with traumatic brain injury whose hand tremor had seemed like an insurmountable barrier to returning to competitive shooting. An elderly man with arthritis who thought his days of precision work were over. Maya's story gave them permission to try again, to see their conditions as variables to work with rather than verdicts of impossibility. The financial pressure that had weighed on Maya for years began to ease as unexpected opportunities emerged. Shooting equipment manufacturers, initially skeptical of associating their brands with a disabled shooter, began to recognize the marketing value of her story. But more than that, they saw genuine technical insights in her adaptive modifications that could benefit all shooters. Precision Arms, the company that had manufactured her rifle stock, offered her a consulting contract to help develop ergonomic equipment for shooters with various physical limitations. The project appealed to Maya's engineering background and gave her a chance to help solve problems she understood intimately. Her day job at the forestry department also evolved. Janet Morrison, her supervisor, had initially worried that Maya's newfound fame might become a distraction from her work. Instead, she found that Maya's increased confidence and public speaking experience made her more effective in her professional role as well. "I don't know what happened to you at that competition, but you're like a different person. More confident, more willing to take on challenging assignments. The other day, you presented to the state legislature about forest fire prevention with more authority than people who've been doing this job for decades." Maya's relationship with her medical condition continued to evolve as well. The essential tremor hadn't disappeared. It probably never would. But her attitude toward it had fundamentally changed. Instead of seeing it as a limitation, she'd begun to view it as a unique characteristic that had taught her valuable lessons about adaptation and patience. Dr. Sarah Kim, the young shooter from the competition who had become a close friend, was pursuing her medical degree with a new focus on adaptive medicine, inspired partly by Maya's example. They met regularly for coffee and shooting sessions, Sarah learning from Maya's experience while offering her own insights from medical school. "You know what's amazing about what you did?" Sarah said during one of their range sessions. "It wasn't just about proving you could still shoot well. You proved that there's often more than one way to achieve excellence. Most people assume that perfection requires the absence of flaws, but you showed that sometimes our supposed weaknesses can become our greatest strengths."
"We've had so many inquiries since your win," Carol explained. "People who were inspired by your story but don't feel ready to compete in regular divisions. We're thinking about creating an adaptive division, not separate because we think these shooters can't compete with anyone else, but because some people might benefit from modified equipment rules or different distance requirements while they're learning to work with their conditions." Maya was intrigued by the idea, but also concerned about the implications. "I don't want to create a separate but equal situation," she said. "Part of what made my win meaningful was that I competed against everyone else under the same rules." "Absolutely," Carol agreed. "The adaptive division would be a pathway, not a destination. Give people a place to build confidence and develop techniques with the expectation that they'd eventually move into regular competition if they chose to." The project consumed much of Maya's free time over the following months, working with medical professionals, adaptive sports organizations, and equipment manufacturers to develop rules and guidelines that would be both meaningful and inclusive. The first adaptive division competition was scheduled for the following summer at Blackwater Ridge, with Maya serving as the technical advisor and featured speaker. Derek Martinson, to his credit, had reached out to Maya several months after their confrontation. His apology was awkward but seemed genuine,
acknowledging that his protest had been motivated more by wounded pride than legitimate concerns about fair play. "I've been shooting competitively for 15 years, he admitted during their phone conversation, and I got used to thinking I understood everything about the sport. Watching you that day, it challenged some assumptions I didn't even know I had. I'm sorry for how I handled it." Maya accepted his apology gracefully, understanding that his reaction had been driven by the same kind of thinking that had once convinced her that her tremor meant the end of her shooting career. People often fear what they don't understand, and excellence achieved through unfamiliar methods can seem threatening to those who've mastered traditional approaches. The second anniversary of her grandfather's death fell on a crisp October morning, and Maya made the familiar drive to the small cemetery where Chen was buried. She brought flowers, as always, but this time she also brought something else: a framed photograph of herself holding the championship trophy, along with a copy of the magazine article that had started so much of what followed. Standing beside his grave, Maya felt a complex mixture of grief and gratitude. Grief for the conversations they'd never have, the shared experiences that had ended too soon, but also profound gratitude for the foundation he'd given her, the principles and techniques that had made her success possible. "I kept the promise, grandfather," she said quietly, placing the photograph against the headstone. "Maybe not the way either of us expected, but I kept it." The wind rustled through the trees around the cemetery, and for a moment Maya could almost hear his voice carried on the breeze, patient, encouraging, filled with the quiet wisdom that had shaped so much of who she'd become. Her life had developed a rhythm now that felt sustainable and meaningful. The forestry job provided stability and professional satisfaction. The consulting work with equipment manufacturers gave her a chance to help solve problems for other adaptive shooters. The speaking engagements allowed her to share lessons that seemed to resonate far beyond the shooting community. But perhaps most importantly, she'd learned to see her tremor not as a medical condition to be overcome, but as an integral part of who she was, a teacher that had shown her the difference between perfection and excellence, between the absence of struggle and the mastery of it.
On quiet Sunday afternoons, Maya would sometimes visit her old shooting club, the same range where she'd first learned to handle a rifle under her grandfather's patient guidance. The young shooters there knew her story, and some would ask for advice about dealing with nerves or performance pressure. Maya would share what she'd learned, but always with the understanding that each person's path to excellence would be uniquely their own. "The mountain doesn't care if you're worthy to climb it," she would tell them, echoing her grandfather's words. "It only cares that you begin the journey." And sometimes the most challenging paths lead to the most beautiful views. 3 years later. The morning sun painted the mountains surrounding Blackwater Ridge in shades of gold and amber as Maya arrived for the 3rd Annual Adaptive Division Championship. What had begun as an experimental program now drew competitors from across North America, their stories as varied as their conditions, but united by a common understanding that limitations often exist more in minds than in bodies. Maya parked near the registration tent, noting with satisfaction the bustle of activity that had become characteristic of these events. 57 competitors had entered this year's adaptive division, more than double the inaugural field. But more encouraging than the numbers was the atmosphere. These weren't shooters making excuses for their limitations, but athletes pushing the boundaries of what was considered possible. She spotted Robert Chen near the equipment check station, his Parkinson's tremor visible but controlled, as he assembled his rifle with the confidence of someone who had learned to work with his condition rather than against it. Beside him, Maria Santos, a veteran who had lost her right arm in Afghanistan, was adjusting the specialized mount system that allowed her to shoot left-handed with remarkable precision. Maya, the voice belonged to Dr. Sarah Kim, now Dr. Kim, after completing her medical residency with a specialization in rehabilitation medicine. Sarah had become not just a close friend, but a crucial bridge between the shooting community and the medical professionals who worked with movement disorder patients.
The adaptive program has been featured in 3 major medical journals this year, Sarah continued excitedly as she approached. And we've had inquiries from shooting organizations in 12 countries about implementing similar programs. You've started something really significant here. Maya smiled, still sometimes surprised by the scope of what had grown from her single perfect score at this same range 3 years earlier. The adaptive division had evolved far beyond her original vision, incorporating insights from occupational therapists, adaptive sports specialists, and engineers to create opportunities for people with an enormous range of physical challenges. Any of the original skeptics here today? Maya asked, remembering the resistance the program had initially faced from some traditional competitors who worried it would somehow diminish the sport. A few, Sarah replied with a grin, including Derek Martinson. He's actually volunteering as a range officer and has been remarkably helpful with the new competitors. People change, I guess. Indeed, they did. Derek had not only apologized for his behavior 3 years earlier, but had become one of the program's most effective advocates, using his reputation in the traditional shooting community to legitimize the adaptive division among shooters who might otherwise dismiss it as charity competition.
The transformation wasn't entirely altruistic. Derek had been diagnosed with early-stage rheumatoid arthritis the previous year, and his own struggles with joint stiffness and occasional hand tremor had given him a more personal understanding of what adaptive shooters faced. Maya had helped him develop techniques for managing his symptoms, and their relationship had evolved from antagonistic to genuinely collaborative. Maya made her way to the technical briefing area, where she would address the competitors before the morning's events began. As the program's founding technical advisor, she still played a central role in these competitions, though her focus had shifted from competing herself to helping others discover their own potential. The crowd that gathered for her pre-competition talk was diverse in ways that went far beyond their various medical conditions. There were teenagers with cerebral palsy shooting alongside retirees with Parkinson's disease. Veterans with traumatic brain injuries shared the firing line with civilians dealing with multiple sclerosis. An 8-year-old girl with a rare genetic condition that affected her motor control was competing in the youth division her mother had pushed to create. "Good morning, everyone," Maya began, looking out at the assembled faces. 3 years ago, I stood on this same range convinced that my essential tremor meant the end of my shooting career. I was wrong about that. But more importantly, I was wrong about what it means to overcome limitations. She paused, gathering her thoughts. These talks had become easier over time, but she still felt the weight of responsibility that came with being seen as a symbol of possibility for people facing their own challenges. I used to think that overcoming meant eliminating, that success required me to somehow stop my hands from shaking. What I learned instead was that overcoming sometimes means embracing. My tremor didn't go away, but it taught me things about patience and timing that I never would have learned with perfectly steady hands. Maya gestured toward the range stretching out behind her. Each of you is here because you refused to accept someone else's definition of what's possible. Maybe that someone was a doctor who told you your condition meant giving up activities you loved. Maybe it was other athletes who couldn't imagine how someone with your challenges could compete. Maybe it was that voice in your own head saying you weren't good enough anymore. The crowd was completely silent now, their attention focused with the intensity Maya recognized from her grandfather's best teaching moments. Today, you have the opportunity to rewrite those definitions, not just for yourselves, but for everyone who will come after you. Every shot you fire, every technique you develop, every barrier you break down makes it easier for the next person facing similar challenges. Maya's eyes found Robert Chen in the crowd, remembering his tears when he'd thought his shooting days were over. Then Maria Santos, whose adaptive equipment innovations were being studied by engineering programs at major universities. Finally, the 8-year-old girl whose presence had forced the program to confront assumptions about age and capability. My grandfather used to say that the mountain doesn't care if you're worthy to climb it. It only cares that you begin the journey. Today, we climb together.
and the view from the summit belongs to all of us." The applause was sustained and heartfelt, but Maya could see that the competitors were already shifting their focus toward the technical challenges ahead. This wasn't a support group or therapy session. It was a serious athletic competition where excellence would be measured in precision and performance. 5 years later, Maya stood in the conference room of the International Paralympic Committee headquarters in Bonn, Germany, still somewhat bewildered by the journey that had brought her here. The proposal she'd been invited to present was ambitious: the inclusion of adaptive shooting sports in the Paralympic Games, with the program pioneered at Blackwater Ridge serving as the foundation for global competition. "The technical standards we've developed have now been adopted by adaptive shooting programs in 47 countries," she explained to the panel of Paralympic officials. "We've demonstrated that these competitions maintain the highest standards of athletic excellence while providing meaningful opportunities for athletes with a wide range of physical challenges." The presentation included video footage from recent adaptive championships, showing the remarkable precision being achieved by shooters whose conditions ranged from essential tremor to spinal cord injuries to limb differences. The scores being posted were competitive with any traditional shooting competition, dispelling any lingering doubts about the athletic legitimacy of the sport. What began as one woman's refusal to accept limitations has evolved into a global movement that challenges fundamental assumptions about disability and athletic achievement, Maya continued. "These athletes aren't competing in spite of their conditions, they're competing because of what those conditions have taught them about adaptation, persistence, and finding excellence through unconventional paths." Dr. Elizabeth Canning, the Paralympic Committee's technical director, leaned forward with obvious interest. "The performance standards you've documented are indeed impressive, but I'm curious about the broader impact. How has this program affected participants beyond their competitive achievements?" Maya had anticipated this question, and her answer drew on 5 years of documentation and follow-up studies that Sarah Kim had helped coordinate through her work in rehabilitation medicine. "We've tracked over 300 participants since the program began. 87% report significant improvements in their management of daily activities related to their conditions. 63% have returned to work or increased their work hours after learning adaptive techniques through shooting. But perhaps most significantly, 91% report improved mental health and self-efficacy." The statistics were compelling, but Maya knew that the real story lay in the individual transformations she'd witnessed. Robert Chen, now in his 8th year of competition, despite progressing Parkinson's disease, had become a mentor to newly diagnosed patients at his local medical center. Maria Santos had started an adaptive sports program for wounded veterans that had expanded to include 8 different activities. The 8-year-old girl, now 13, was developing modifications that were helping other young people with rare genetic conditions participate in precision sports. 7 years later, the crowd at the Paralympic Games in Brisbane was unlike anything Maya had ever experienced. 30,000 spectators filled the temporary shooting venue, their cheers echoing across the range as competitors from 43 nations prepared for the inaugural Paralympic Adaptive Shooting Competition. Maya sat in the technical official section, her role now as head of the International Adaptive Shooting Federation, watching athletes she'd helped train compete on the world's biggest stage. The sport had evolved dramatically since those early days at Blackwater Ridge. Equipment innovations developed through the adaptive program were now being used by traditional shooters as well, improving performance and accessibility across the entire sport. Training techniques pioneered by athletes working with movement disorders had revolutionized coaching methods, emphasizing mental discipline and timing over pure physical strength. Maya's attention was drawn to Lane 7, where Alina Volkov, a Russian shooter with cerebral palsy, was preparing for her final shots in the women's precision rifle competition. Alina's approach reminded Maya of her own development, studying her condition's patterns, learning to work with rather than against her body's rhythms, finding steadiness in the spaces between struggle. The scoreboard showed Alina tied for the lead with 2 shots remaining. The pressure was enormous, the kind that could overwhelm even experienced athletes. But Maya watched with recognition as Alina closed her eyes, took several deep breaths, and settled into the patient waiting that had become characteristic of adaptive shooting technique. When Alina fired her 9th shot, the electronic scoring system immediately displayed the result. 10.9, an X-ring hit that put her ahead of the field with 1 shot remaining. The crowd's roar was
Deafening, but Maya could see Elena was already blocking out the noise, focusing inward on the rhythm she'd learned to trust. The final shot seemed to take forever. Elena waited through several cycles of her muscle spasms, refusing to rush despite the pressure of the moment. When she finally fired, the result was immediate and decisive. Another X-ring hit, giving her not just a gold medal, but a new Paralympic record. Maya found herself in tears as Elena celebrated with her coaches and teammates. This was what she and her grandfather had dreamed of without ever quite articulating it, a world where excellence was defined not by the absence of struggle, but by the mastery of it. "10 years later. The Chen Memorial Range at Blackwater Ridge had grown far beyond its original scope. What had once been a single 800-meter range now encompassed multiple distances, adaptive equipment testing facilities, and a research center where sports scientists studied the intersection of human adaptation and athletic performance. Maya served as the facility's director, splitting her time between administration and hands-on work with athletes. On this particular autumn morning, she was working with Jamie Martinez, a 12-year-old whose juvenile arthritis had initially made his parents reluctant to let him try shooting sports. Jamie's condition caused unpredictable flares of joint pain and stiffness, but he'd shown remarkable aptitude for reading his body's signals and adapting his technique accordingly. "Remember," Maya told him as he settled behind his rifle, "the pain isn't your enemy. It's information. What is it telling you about your position right now?" Jamie considered the question seriously, adjusting his grip slightly. "My left elbow is pretty stiff today, so I need to modify my support hand position, and the flare in my wrists means I should wait for the inflammation cycle to ease before I take the shot." Maya nodded approvingly. At 12, Jamie already understood principles that many adult athletes struggled to grasp. His approach to managing his arthritis through shooting actually improved his overall medical management, giving him tools for reading his body's signals that extended far beyond the range. "Your first instructor might not understand these modifications," Maya warned him. Jamie was preparing to move beyond the adaptive program into mainstream junior competition, a transition that still sometimes required education of coaches and officials unfamiliar with adaptive techniques. "That's okay," Jamie replied with the confidence of someone who'd already faced skepticism and overcome it. "I'll show them that different doesn't mean worse. Maybe I'll teach them something new." Maya smiled, hearing echoes of her own journey in his words. The adaptive shooting program had succeeded beyond her wildest expectations, but perhaps more importantly, it had created a generation of athletes who saw challenges as opportunities for innovation rather than excuses for limitation. 15 years later. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early spring, delivered to Maya's office at the research center by a postal worker who'd been making this same delivery for over a decade. The return address was unfamiliar, but something about the careful handwriting reminded Maya of her grandfather's precise script. Inside, she found a message from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, now retired from Precision Shooting magazine, but still following the adaptive shooting community she'd helped publicize from its earliest days. "Dear Maya," the letter began, "I wanted you to know about something remarkable that happened at a shooting competition in Singapore last month.
a young woman named Lin Wei, no relation to your grandfather, but interesting coincidence, won the Women's Precision Rifle Championship using techniques directly descended from your original adaptive methods.
Maya continued reading with growing amazement. Lin Wei didn't have a movement disorder or any obvious physical limitation. She'd simply learned that the timing and patience techniques developed for adaptive shooting made her more accurate than traditional approaches. Her victory had sparked interest in adaptive techniques among conventional shooters, creating a full circle moment where methods developed for special circumstances were being recognized as superior for all athletes. What you started as a way to work around limitations has become a pathway to excellence that transcends any specific condition, the letter continued. Your grandfather would be amazed to see how far his little sparrow has flown. Maya set the letter aside and walked to the window of her office, looking out at the range where dozens of athletes were training. Some were preparing for Paralympic competition, others for local club matches. Some had obvious physical challenges. Others struggled with invisible conditions like her own tremor. Still others were simply pursuing excellence through unconventional methods. At 47, Maya's own essential tremor had neither worsened nor improved significantly. It remained a constant presence in her life, but one that no longer defined her limitations. She still competed occasionally, more for the joy of the sport than any need to prove herself. Her scores remained competitive, a testament to the techniques she'd developed and refined over years of adaptation. The medallion her grandfather had left her hung in a place of honor on her office wall, next to photographs spanning 15 years of adaptive shooting achievements, Paralympic gold medals, research breakthroughs, equipment innovations, and most importantly, individual stories of people who'd refused to accept others' definitions of what was possible. 20 years later, Maya stood before the graduating class of the Chen Institute for Adaptive Athletics, addressing young people who would carry the program's philosophy into fields far beyond shooting sports. The institute had expanded its mission over the years, developing adaptive techniques for dozens of different activities and training coaches, therapists, and athletes in the principles that had emerged from those early experiments at Blackwater Ridge. 20 years ago, Maya told the graduates, I thought I was just trying to save my own shooting career. I had no idea that learning to work with my tremor would lead to insights that could help people with conditions I'd never heard of, competing in sports I'd never imagined. The audience included adaptive athletes preparing for careers in coaching and sports science, medical professionals specializing in rehabilitation, and engineers developing the next generation of adaptive equipment. But it also included people like David Kim, Sarah's younger brother, who had no physical limitations but had chosen to study adaptive techniques because he believed they represented a more holistic approach to human performance. The most important lesson we've learned, Maya continued, isn't about shooting or sports or even adaptation. It's about the difference between perfection and excellence. Perfection is the absence of flaws. Excellence is the mastery of them. As she spoke, her hands trembled slightly. They always would, but the tremor no longer felt like a limitation or an embarrassment. It was simply part of who she was, a teacher that had shown her the difference between strength and steadiness, between winning and achieving. The wind rustled through the trees around the cemetery, carrying the scent of sage from the high desert and the distant sound of rifle fire from the range where new generations of adaptive athletes were learning to find excellence through struggle. Maya reached into her pocket and pulled out a small brass object, not a cartridge case this time, but a miniature rifle crafted by one of her former students as a retirement gift. She placed it beside the flowers, a symbol of the community that had grown from her grandfather's simple lessons about finding stillness in storms. As she walked back to her car, Maya felt a profound sense of completion. The tremor in her hands had never disappeared, but it had led her to discoveries that neither she nor her grandfather could have imagined. What had begun as a limitation had become a doorway to understanding human potential in entirely new ways.
The mountain her grandfather had spoken of, the one that didn't care if she was worthy to climb it, had turned out to be higher and more beautiful than either of them had realized. And the view from the summit belonged not just to her, but to everyone who had found the courage to begin the journey despite their apparent limitations. 47 consecutive years later. On a crisp October morning that marked the 47th anniversary of Maya's championship performance, a crowd gathered at the Chen Memorial Range for a celebration unlike any before. Representatives from 52 countries had come to Blackwater Ridge to commemorate not just Maya's achievement, but the global transformation it had inspired. Maya, now 79, and moving carefully with the aid of a walking stick, was helped to a place of honor near the 800-meter firing line. Her essential tremor had evolved over the decades, sometimes better, sometimes worse, but always a companion rather than an enemy. Beside her sat Elena Volkov, the Paralympic champion who now directed the International Adaptive Athletics Federation, and Jamie Martinez, whose childhood arthritis had led him to a career in sports medicine and adaptive equipment design. The ceremony wasn't about nostalgia, it was about legacy. Adaptive shooting techniques had revolutionized coaching across dozens of sports. The principles of working with, rather than against physical limitations, had transformed rehabilitation medicine. Equipment innovations pioneered for adaptive athletes were now standard throughout the sporting world. But perhaps most significantly, the fundamental understanding of what constituted a limitation had changed. Maya's trembling hands had taught the world that excellence often emerges not from the absence of struggle, but from the creative response to it. As the ceremony concluded, a young shooter named Alex Chen, no relation, but carrying the name with pride, prepared to attempt 47 consecutive bullseyes at 800 meters, matching the number that had given the day its significance. Alex had been born with a rare neurological condition that caused unpredictable muscle spasms, but had learned to work with these episodes using techniques that traced their lineage directly back to Maya's original innovations. The crowd fell silent as Alex settled into position. Through the spotting scopes, observers could see the familiar pattern, waiting, breathing, studying the body's rhythms, finding the moments of stillness between chaos. The first shot rang out, followed by the distinctive ping of steel hit at long range. One by one, the shots followed. Each perfect hit was a testament not just to individual skill, but to the understanding that excellence comes in many forms, achieved through many paths. Maya watched with tears in her eyes as Alex completed the sequence, 47 consecutive bullseyes fired by hands that shook with neurological storm, but had learned to find precision in the spaces between struggle.
The final shot echoed across the range and faded into the mountain silence. The crowd erupted in celebration, but Maya's attention was drawn to something smaller and more personal. A young sparrow had landed on the fence post beside her chair, its tiny body trembling in the autumn breeze as it prepared to take flight. For a moment, girl and bird regarded each other with mutual recognition. Then the sparrow spread its wings and launched itself into the sky, its flight path uncertain but determined, carried forward not by the absence of wind, but by the skill to navigate within it. Maya smiled and closed her eyes, feeling the desert wind on her face and hearing in its whisper the voice of her grandfather, patient and proud. "Well done, little sparrow. Well done." Elena Volkov, now 93 and one of the last surviving athletes from the early Paralympic adaptive shooting competitions, moved slowly through the center's museum with the help of her great-granddaughter, Anya, a neuroscientist studying the genetic factors that influenced adaptation to neurological conditions. "Tell me again about the early days, babushka," Anya requested, pausing before a display case containing Maya's original rifle and the brass medallion that had been donated to the museum upon Maya's death 10 years earlier. "It was different then,"
Elena replied, her accent still carrying traces of her Russian childhood despite 7 decades in America. People thought that if your body didn't work the normal way, you were broken. Maya taught us that we weren't broken. We were just learning to be excellent in ways that no one had seen before. The museum told the story through artifacts, photographs, and interactive displays that allowed visitors to experience simulated versions of various conditions and the adaptive techniques developed to work with them. Children regularly toured the facility as part of school programs designed to expand their understanding of human diversity and potential. Anya paused before a section dedicated to the first generation, the original adaptive athletes whose innovations had laid the foundation for everything that followed. Maya's photograph held the central position, but she was surrounded by images of Robert Chen, Maria Santos, Derek Martinson, who had become an unexpected advocate after his own diagnosis, and dozens of others whose willingness to challenge assumptions had changed the world's understanding of limitation and possibility. What was she like personally? Anya asked, studying Maya's photograph. All the stories make her sound almost mythical. Elena smiled, remembering countless conversations over decades of friendship. She was just a person, trying to figure things out, like all of us. The difference was that she refused to accept other people's definitions of what was possible, and she had this gift for helping others see that their own definitions might be too narrow as well. The conversation was interrupted by the soft chime of a notification from Anya's research tablet. Her latest experiment, studying the neural pathways activated by adaptive timing techniques, produced results that confirmed theories Maya had proposed purely from intuitive observation 60 years earlier. Even now, she's still teaching us, Anya murmured as she reviewed the data. The brain scans show exactly what she described, that working with neurological variation actually creates stronger, more flexible neural networks than trying to force normal patterns. 75 years later, the global celebration marking the 75th anniversary of Maya's record-breaking performance took place simultaneously in hundreds of locations worldwide, connected by immersive holographic technology that allowed participants to share the experience despite being separated by continents. The event had grown far beyond the shooting sports community to encompass anyone whose life had been touched by the principles Maya had discovered. In Singapore, Dr. Lin Wei, the shooter whose victory using adaptive techniques had marked a turning point in the sport's evolution, addressed a gathering of adaptive athletes preparing for the 2100 Paralympic Games. At 102, she remained sharp and engaged, her own essential tremor having developed in her 80s but presenting no barrier to her continued involvement in competitive shooting. Maya Chen didn't just change how we think about disability, she changed how we think about excellence itself. She proved that the best version of human performance isn't the absence of struggle, it's the creative mastery of it. In Berlin, the European Center for Adaptive Athletics hosted a demonstration of the latest equipment innovations, many of which would have seemed like science fiction in Maya's era. Neural interfaces that could translate thought into precise motor commands, exoskeletons that enhanced rather than replaced natural movement, and training systems that used virtual reality to help athletes optimize their adaptive techniques. But for all the technological advancement, the fundamental principles remained unchanged. Work with your body rather than against it, find strength in supposed weakness, and never accept others' definitions of what's possible. In Tokyo, centenarian Jamie Martinez participated in the anniversary celebration from his wheelchair, his juvenile arthritis having evolved into systemic complications that limited his mobility, but not his influence as one of the world's leading experts on adaptive sports medicine. Surrounded by students and colleagues from around the globe, he reflected on a lifetime spent applying lessons learned from a 12-year-old's determination to shoot despite joint pain. Every technique we use today traces its lineage back to that October afternoon when Maya decided her tremor was just another variable to master, he said. We've refined the methods, expanded the applications, developed the technology, but we haven't improved on the basic insight that humans are infinitely more adaptable than anyone imagined. 100 years later. The world of 2124 bore little resemblance to the one Maya had known, but the principles she'd discovered remained as relevant as ever. Humanity had expanded beyond Earth, faced climate crises, developed artificial intelligence that challenged traditional notions of consciousness, and made medical advances that could eliminate most neurological conditions before birth. Yet people still chose to preserve genetic variations that previous generations might have considered disabilities, recognizing them as sources of cognitive and creative diversity that enriched human potential. The Maya question, whether to fix neurological differences or learn to work with them, had become a central debate in bioethics and human enhancement philosophy. Dr. Zara Chen Okafor, a fifth-generation descendant of one of Maya's early students, directed the Off-World Athletics Federation from the lunar colony of Armstrong Base. The low-gravity environment had created new possibilities for adaptive athletics, allowing people with mobility limitations on Earth to achieve forms of movement that surpassed traditional human capabilities. Maya Chen's legacy isn't about shooting or sports or even adaptation. It's about the fundamental human capacity to transform limitations into possibilities. That lesson is as relevant on the Moon as it was in the Oregon Desert a century ago. The facility's main range stretched across 5 kilometers of lunar surface, where athletes with a wide variety of conditions trained for competitions that would have been impossible in Earth's gravity. But the techniques they used, the patient study of bodily rhythms, the willingness to wait for optimal moments, and the creative adaptation to physical constraints, traced their lineage directly back to a trembling woman learning to find stillness in her storm. As the centennial celebration reached its conclusion, a moment of silence was observed across all human settlements in honor of Maya Chen and the countless individuals whose struggles had taught humanity that excellence comes in infinite forms. In that silence, carried across space by quantum communication networks that connected Earth to its furthest colonies, the echo of a single gunshot from an Oregon desert range seemed to reverberate still. A reminder that sometimes the most profound changes begin with one person's refusal to accept the word impossible. The brass medallion Maya had worn, now preserved in a climate-controlled case at the Center for Human Potential, bore an inscription her grandfather had placed there decades before her birth: "For the sparrow who learns to fly in the storm." Neither Chen Wei nor his granddaughter could have imagined how far that sparrow's flight would carry humanity's understanding of its own limitless potential. But perhaps they would have smiled to know that children in distant worlds still learned the lesson Maya had taught, that the mountain doesn't care if you're worthy to climb it. It only cares that you have the courage to begin the journey. And in the vast universe that humanity was still learning to explore, there were always more mountains to climb, more storms to fly through, more definitions of impossible waiting to be proven wrong by someone willing to tremble their way towards excellence. Subscribe to She Stood First, where silence is never forgotten.